Greetings, folks, and welcome to our little talk about global English. My intention here is to give you a little sample, a little taste of how English works around the world in non-native English-speaking communities. Of course, naturally, it makes sense that we've spent the entire year up to this point talking about the development of English as a native tongue in various regions around the world, and at various times over the last 1,500 years. But because English is a global language and has become a part of communities whose first language is not English, it's, I think, necessary to at least touch upon that reality and explore it even just a little bit before we wrap things up. It feels to me, as I'm looking at the end of the term and thinking about how many people actually speak the language and the various contexts in which it's used, that spending just a single lecture on this topic is kind of like skipping a stone across the ocean. But at least if you do that, you get a sense that the ocean is there. And of course, with anything I bring up, if anyone is curious, I'd be more than happy to point out suggestions for further exploration. If you wanted to have a sense of the various fields around the world in which English is either very important or essential, then here are 5 fairly obvious ones. Diplomacy. The 6 official languages of the UN are Arabic, English, French, Mandarin, Russian, and Spanish in alphabetical order. And between them, these languages account for the home tongues of the majority of the population on Earth currently, and also account for a majority of countries in terms of official languages. If we want to be specific to English, though, we can take a look at the fields of commerce, in which English is the international language of communication. At science and technology, the majority of peer-reviewed publications in these fields are English language publications, and if you want to do high-level research in either of these, it's maybe not impossible, but damn difficult to do it if you aren't fluent in English. The same is true of medicine, and I remember when I was moving to Korea being told that if I ever got into trouble and needed to contact someone who spoke English, the first thing I should look for is a doctor's office, because you can't study medicine and be up to date on all of the latest practices and procedures if you don't read English fluently. And also the international language of air traffic controllers, a pretty important thing when you're flying 5 miles or 6 miles above the surface of the Earth, is English. That is, the entire international air traffic system is integrated really into a single functioning system using the English language as its medium. But if you want a more specific example, I think you might find the next one interesting. In 2010, the online shopping platform Rakuten, based out of Japan, made the announcement that it would be making English its official language of doing business, even in its home offices, in 2012. And on January 1st of 2012, this policy came into effect. Rakuten's business model is like a combination between Amazon and eBay. And as long as we're talking Amazon, they have since acquired ownership of the Kobo ebook reading platform. Even at the time that they made this announcement, they were actually one of the larger global e-commerce companies in the world. So you might wonder why a Japanese company employing mostly Japanese employees centered in, I believe, Tokyo, would decide to make English the language of its main office. But there actually is a very sound rationale. And they did, of course, provide training and continue to provide training for their employees if employees are coming in without the requisite English language expertise. But the rationale is basically this. English is the global language of business right now. And Rakuten has offices around the world. And they can't expect the home language of these offices to be Japanese, because they simply wouldn't be able to hire people. So if all offices in the company are speaking the same language, this makes inter-office communication much more easy and much more effective. And as I mentioned on the last slide, English is the language internationally speaking right now of innovation in science and technology. Well, if you're an online marketing platform, science and technology are the things that you need the most. And a company whose home language is not English has to often wait for new cutting-edge research and development to be translated into their own language before they can take advantage of it. That is, this places them at a time lag. But if the language of their corporate culture is the language in which the cutting-edge research and development is being done, they have instantaneous access to it in the same way that their competitors, for example, in the States, obvious examples being Amazon and PayPal, also do. So this amounts to a leveling of the playing field in terms of international competition. Also, if their language or when their language of operation in their home office was Japanese, of course, they could very easily hire Japanese speakers. But this restricted their potential talent pool to only Japanese speakers, with maybe a few rare exceptions, if there was someone they really wanted and who was willing to put in the work to learn Japanese. Well, if their home language is all of a sudden English, they can hire expertise from all over the world, and they do. So in that simple policy change, their potential hiring pool grew exponentially. And of course, no business is an island. They have relations with other businesses from whom they need things in order to actually keep themselves functioning. Well, insofar as English is, and for the time being is likely to remain, the international language of commerce, it's simply to their advantage to be able to speak that language at the drop of a hat, where literally anyone in the office who picks up a phone can have a conversation in English with somebody in an office anywhere else in the world. In the time since making this decision, they have become more successful than they already were. And a number of other businesses have followed suit, recognizing their success. In fact, even by the end of 2012, Airbus, Daimler Chrysler, Fast Retailing, Nokia, Renault, Samsung, SAP, Technicolor, and Microsoft Beijing had all also adopted this policy, and for the exact same reasons. And if you wanted to broaden the context a bit and simply think about numbers of speakers in various categories, this also tells a really interesting story. Here's a table, which I've also included on a handout in the Moodle page, listing the top 10 most common languages in 3 categories: native speakers, total speakers, and official language in number of countries. Anything that has more than one entry, I've color-coded for the sake of reference. Now we'll notice that in native speakers and total speakers, and this is measured by speakers with a high degree of fluency, Mandarin is the top language in the world, with Spanish coming in as the second most common native language, and English as the third most common native language. When we move into total speakers, Spanish and English switch places. And when we look at the measure of official language in number of countries, English all of a sudden is at the top of the list. Now, this table tells a really interesting story if you look at the other languages. And just to be clear, these numbers are from 2017. So we'll take a look at the top 10 native languages: Mandarin, Spanish, English, Hindi, Arabic, Portuguese, Bengali, Indonesian, Russian, and Japanese. Well, when we take a look at total speakers, the numbers change around a bit, but most of the same players remain on the list. So we have Mandarin, English, Spanish, Hindi, Arabic, French making its appearance, Portuguese, Bengali, Indonesian, and Russian. And then when we take a look at languages that are official by number of countries, we have English, French, Arabic, Spanish, Portuguese, German, Berber, Swahili, Serbo-Croatian, and Russian. Now let's take a look at the top 5 in that third category: English, French, Arabic, Spanish, and Portuguese. All five of these are the languages of expansionist empires, four of them being European. It's easy to forget that there was a massive Arab empire stretching from Central Asia across North Africa and up into the Iberian Peninsula at a time when Western Europe was still an intellectual and cultural backwater. That is, all of these are imperial languages, and four of them date to the period of European colonization. And as for English, coming in at 59, it has more than twice the number of countries where it's an official language than the runner-up, being French. Oh, and speaking of French, you may notice in the column total speakers, French has two numbers, 80 million and 153 million, adding up to their actual total of 233 million. The first number is the number of native speakers, and that's given because they don't appear on the number of native speakers column. And then the second number is the number of French second language or French foreign language speakers. Together, these give us the total. And of course, just to be clear, you could easily point out that China and Russia both have empires, and China has had one for a very long time. The difference here, of course, being that, at least where the Chinese empire is concerned, they tended to expand and absorb and remain a single country. Russia took mostly a similar approach, and the countries other than Russia, where Russian remains an official language, are all members of the former USSR, which of course broke up at the end of the Cold War. Now, if we turn our attention to those countries or jurisdictions where English is an official language, we also see an interesting story emerging, don't we? Some of these are, of course, the obvious large ones: Canada, the United States, Britain, of course, Australia, New Zealand, many island nations in the Caribbean, much of Africa, and a whole lot of other island nations in Oceania as well. As the old saying used to go, the sun never set on the British Empire, and all of these countries were, at one point, part of the British Empire, and the majority of them remain part of the British Commonwealth. In many of these countries, though, of course, English is not the majority language, as we saw with our discussion of South Africa in the last lecture, where you'll recall English is only spoken as a native language by a little over 8% of the population and by 45% of the population all told, although that number has probably gone up a bit since those data were taken. When we change the criteria again and look at jurisdictions, be they countries or self-governing territories, where English is a primary language without worrying about whether or not it's official, then we have a different kind of story, don't we? Here we see, of course, the usual suspects, all the big English places, but a number of little places show up with often very small populations. So on the one hand, the number of jurisdictions is a little bit deceptive. But on the other, all those places with small populations tell really interesting stories. There are, for example, the Channel Islands of Guernsey and Jersey. These are islands off of the coast of France that English maintained after it lost all of its land holdings on the continent. These islands were both occupied by the Germans during the Second World War. There is Gibraltar, one of the two pillars of Hercules, guarding the entrance to the Mediterranean, and for which, as we discussed, Britain sort of indirectly sacrificed its hold on the 13 colonies that would become the United States. Well, there are about 32,000 people there, and they print their own money, and it is very much its own place. Then we have the South Atlantic islands of St. Helena, Ascension Island, and Tristan da Cunha, the latter of which, by the way, is, if measured by distance from land, the most isolated place on Earth. Now, the English spoken on these islands somewhat resembles the English spoken in South Africa. So if we take that measure of distance from any mainland, then the residents of Tristan da Cunha are probably the most isolated year-round community on the planet. And St. Helena is actually the place where Napoleon died. And as long as we're in the South Atlantic, we can also take a look at South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands, which, as you'll see, have no permanent residents at all, though there is a temporary population of about 30 people. Now, there's an interesting history here. In fact, it was the Argentine claim of sovereignty over one of the South Sandwich Islands that lay behind the 1982 Falklands War, as up until 1985, these islands were administered from the Falklands. But when I show this list to a live class, the one that students always ask about is Pitcairn, with a total population of 56. So I think that's the last one of these little ones that I'll discuss. The Pitcairn Islands are yet another British overseas territory. These ones located in the South Pacific rather than the South Atlantic, not terribly far from Tahiti. Well, as some of you may know, there was a rather famous mutiny on a ship called the HMS Bounty in 1789, the Bounty being tasked with transporting breadfruit plants from Tahiti to the West Indies. Well, in a nutshell, the story is this. Many of the crew were unhappy with Bligh's seemingly excessive discipline, at least in their opinions, and given how harsh British naval discipline was at the time, that says a lot. During the return from Tahiti, after 5 months spent on the island, during which the men had actually in many cases formed relationships with local women, a number of the sailors, led by master's mate Christian Fletcher, decided to mutiny. They kicked Bligh and a number of loyal sailors and officers off the ship in the ship's launch, which did eventually make its way back to England, and then went into hiding for themselves, because of course you don't mutiny on a British ship without expecting consequences. Some of the men went to Tahiti, where they were apprehended a couple of years later, and the remainder, including Fletcher Christian, sailed the Bounty to Pitcairn and set it on fire. They avoided capture, and in fact were never found until 1808, by which time all but one of the original mutineers were dead, killed either by each other or by the islanders. And by that time, the one remaining mutineer, his name was John Adams, was pardoned, or at least was never charged. But the population of the Pitcairn Islands is descended from those original mutineers and the Polynesian women with whom they had children. The island has no airport and is visited by a supply ship only 4 times per year. And the supply ship is the only way on and off the island. So once again, this is one of the more isolated communities in the world. When we turn to general international English, though, which is where we started, the numbers get a lot bigger than 56, don't they? One way of looking at this is as a system of concentric circles. This model was first proposed by Cattrew in 1992, and while there are some flaws to it, certainly, it's still, I think, maybe useful to have in mind. Cattrew divided the English-speaking community, or the English-speaking world, into 3 circles. An inner circle, where English is a native language, and a native language of, if not most, then a substantial minority of the population. So here we have Britain, Anglo-Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, and the native English-speaking segment of South Africa, for example. By Cattrew's numbers, as of 2006, this population was about 380 million, about 260 million of whom lived in the US. So the United States has by far the largest number of native English speakers in the world. Then we move to the outer circle. And here the numbers get a little fuzzy because it depends on the criteria of fluency that you actually use. So you could have anywhere between 150 and 300 million English speakers in the outer circle. And again, these are Cattrew's numbers. The outer circle consists of countries that have been the object of expansion by inner circle countries, so basically colonies, where English is a language of acquisition, a language of administration, but not the first language of the majority, certainly. and not a language in everyday use outside of certain relatively specialized contexts, such as, for example, administration, government. This is how English seems to function in India, for example, and also in Pakistan, in many of the African nations, and also in many of the Caribbean nations, although some of the Caribbean nations also fall into the inner circle. And then outside of the outer circle, we have what's called the expanding circle. These are countries where English has no official status, and yet where acquisition of English as a second or foreign language, often for business or economic purposes, is fairly common. Here you have countries like China, Russia, Brazil, Japan, Korea. That is, this is where the big markets for ESL teaching are. And the population of this group could be anywhere between 100 million and a billion people, again, depending on the fluency criteria that you're actually using. If you use relatively loose criteria, that is, if you don't insist on something like native or advanced fluency, then the number of English speakers in the expanding circle constitutes the largest number of speakers of English in the world. This is politically and socially, I think, important, because what it actually means is that the majority of speakers of English in the world are not native speakers, and they're using the language to their own purposes, which, of course, is how any language is going to be used. So again, this is a value-free statement. But what it also means is that the needs that the language must meet in these circumstances are not the full range of needs that a community of native speakers actually has. For example, the production of literature is just not a factor. The acquisition of English in the expanding circle is a purely pragmatic attainment for the most part. So the language is used for academic purposes, say, for commercial purposes, largely, but very rarely for aesthetic purposes. What this means is that the patterns of communication are going to be different. Sentence structures will be shorter. Grammatical structures will be simplified, not to the point where it becomes a pidgin, but certainly to the point where someone who does not have complete mastery of the language can follow along and use it with some degree of comfort. And often as well, in that expanding circle, you will see English words creeping into the various local languages and taking on their own usages, becoming sort of their own, not quite Creole, because this is simply a matter of vocabulary, but becoming their own particular localized usages of English words, and often very highly modified forms of English words. The textbook provides you several examples of what is called Singlish, that is, the various adaptations of English vocabulary to the day-to-day lives of the people of Singapore. There are other types of adaptations around as well. There's Janglish in Japan, there's Konglish in Korea. I've provided you a handout with several examples of those. And I think for the final part of our little talk right now, I'd just like to take a look at a few of the examples of Konglish. And this may seem self-centered, I hope not. It's just that because I'm no longer that comfortable with Korean, but I have some understanding of the language, I can actually address Konglish more effectively than I can address either Janglish or Singlish. So we'll finish up with that, then I'll let you go for now and follow up within the next 24 hours with a review session and a few words about the exam. So now I think as a final bit of our little talk, I'd like to get into just a little bit of Konglish with you. Now, this and the next two slides basically reproduce one page of a handout that I've posted to the Moodle page, but I've included it in the slideshow, not because I want to go through every single word, because I don't, but rather because talking about a few of them may actually be kind of interesting in looking at how other cultures adapt English to their purposes, because that's the stage that English is at right now in many cases. We've seen, for example, English import numerous words from numerous languages to its own purposes, changing their pronunciation, of course, in the process to fit the phonetic patterns of English rather than, say, French or Algonquian or Russian or Spanish or God knows what. Well, turnabout is fair play, isn't it? On this slide here, I'd like to first take a look at the third item on the list, which in English in the middle column is written telebi pro, but in Korean would be pronounced telebi pro, which of course means television program. Now here, the reason I want to draw your attention to that is that we see vocabulary in English bumping up against Korean phonetics and English words being adapted to the phonetics of another language. There is no v, for example, in Korean, so a v will always become a b. And also, there is a pattern of alternating consonants and vowels in syllables. If you take a look, for example, at the left-hand column, which has it written in Korean, and I realize you can't read the Korean, each of those syllables begins with a consonant, has a second letter as a vowel, and if there is a third letter in the syllable, which is at the bottom, it will be a consonant. That is, those syllables are read diagonally, basically, from top left to bottom right. And one thing you can't do in Korean, but that you can do in English, is have two consonants side by side in the same syllable. So, where telebi is television, and of course, because the etymology doesn't matter, the form of the original word doesn't matter, it's imported in such a way that it's easy to say in the importing language. So television becomes telebi. Similarly, pro, or pro, which is an abbreviation for program, you can't say pro in Korean because it has two consonants in a row. You have to have a vowel between them. So pro is pro. The next one I'd like to look at is a little further down. Of course, in English it looks like it just says driver, which is for screwdriver, but in Korean would be pronounced drive. Now this is kind of interesting because we have a two-syllable word becoming a four-syllable word. Because, as I already said, you can't have two consonants bumped up against each other. But also, the I diphthong doesn't exist in Korean. It becomes two distinct vowel sounds. It's broken into two syllables. So the I becomes ai. And of course, there is no terminal R in Korean, so the verb becomes b. And I realize now, as I was about to move on to the next slide, I skipped over one of my favorite ones on this page. A little further up, it says remicon, or remicon. Now, that's not too far away from what the English looks like, but what it means is ready-mix concrete truck. So again, we have syllables being drawn from the original words, and their meanings being imported, but the words themselves being broken down because they don't matter. What matters is the meaning and the sound being adapted to the language. So this is a really wonderful example of the way, or the ways in which various ESL communities around the world are using English vocabulary simply to suit their own purposes, in ways that English has used many other languages over the last many centuries to suit its purposes. Now, on this slide, the first word I want to talk about is the one at the very top. In the middle column, it says omurice, or in IPA, omurice, which is an omelet with rice filling, and by the way, it's delicious. The reason I bring this one up, though, is that, of course, the word rice is kept. The English word rice is kept here. Rice in Korean is pap, and it is eaten with every meal. If you want to ask if someone is hungry, or a basic question of hospitality is something like pamagosoyo, have you eaten rice? Rice is synonymous with eating. But yeah, the fact that they actually kept the English word for rice rather than using the Korean word for rice is very much worth mentioning here. The other one I wanted to talk about on this slide is demo, for demonstration or protest. Now, it's not that Koreans don't have a history of standing up against authority that they don't respect. They actually do. But the fact that that particular word, which came into the language, I would say probably in the 1960s, says a lot about the interaction of cultures or the exchange of cultures. One of the critiques that many East Asian cultures have against North American culture is its excessive individuality, its rejection of authority. So that the word for demonstration or protest comes out of English, I think is culturally very interesting. In any case, I think I'm going to move on to the next slide. As for this last slide, there are a few things here I wouldn't mind talking about just a little bit. One is in the middle column, meeting or meeting, which actually means blind date. And there are a number of terms on this slide that remind me of my time teaching actually overseas, when I would ask my students what they did for the weekend, and they would say something like, oh, I had a meeting. And what that meant is that, yeah, they were on a date, but specifically a blind date. The idea or the notion that the blind date, the concept of blind date, has an English word defining it or an English word encircling it, says a fair bit about the culture, doesn't it? It indicates the ways in which English-speaking, and particularly American culture, have influenced this particular country. Other ones that are interesting on this page, panty for underwear, either male or female, and cunning. This is the one that fascinates me most, actually, of all of the Konglish elements on this page, because I used to hear it a lot when I was teaching over there. In English, in Standard English, cunning is, well, it comes from Old English and it means to know, but it tends to take on dubious moral implications even in Standard English, but not necessarily bad. You can be, for example, a cunning warrior, and that's good. You can be a cunning strategist, and that's good. But cunning in Konglish is quite literally cheating. And quite frankly, there is something refreshingly anti-authoritarian about that I do kind of respect. But I'm drifting very far wide of my mark in teaching the history of the English language, so I should probably draw this to a close. My purpose in exploring Konglish was just in taking a look at how other cultures actually use English, as English, sort of almost like an exploding supernova, moves far beyond what it originally was and becomes the seeds of something else, as the nebulae of exploded supernovas become the material from which future star systems are actually made. Sorry for the awkward metaphor. I've been watching Cosmos with my daughter lately. In any case, I should probably stop talking now and edit and post this thing so that you all can listen to it in a reasonable time. So that about wraps it up for now. I hope you found this interesting and useful. And of course, anything I bring up here we can talk about on Friday if you feel like. Next time out, which will be our last talk, I'll try to draw everything we've been doing over the last few months into something like a coherent picture, and, as I said before, talk to you a little bit about the exam. Until then, thanks very much for listening, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye for now.